Good morning. Thank you so much for coming to the second day of the Youth-Nex conference and to this panel entitled Restoring Justice in Our Schools, Positive Youth Development Approaches to the Discipline Gap. My name is Leilani Keys, as Joanna mentioned. I'm a high school teacher in a local school here, Albemarle High School. I'm also the coordinator for professional development for diversity in the division, and I'm a part of the ACPS Diversity and Equity team, which we have represented here today. I've been honored to be a part of this conference over the past 2 days, and I've seen things like many of you in the audience through the lens of an educator who tries to be culturally responsive. It's been made abundantly clear in the panels that we saw yesterday that we have a responsibility as educators who are on the front lines with our students each and every day, that we must not accept the status quo, that we have to dive deep into disparities that cause our marginalized students disempowerment and academic challenges, and that above all, we need to analyze our own biases that contribute to these disparities and work for change. So one such disparity that has caused me to take pause, especially lately because there's been more national press about it, has been the deficit thinking and stereotypical thinking that has led to discipline disparities. One such example is an incident recently when a young man named Ahmed brought a clock to school. You remember this, that he'd made it home and was not just suspended, but arrested for suspicion of manufacturing a bomb. And so as an ESOL and an ethnic studies teacher at Albemarle High School, I'm very aware of how these racial, cultural, or linguistic differences are often met with insensitivity and how that can increase the rates of suspension and expulsion from our schools. Students in my ethnic studies class report all of the time that they have feelings of being racially profiled, not just in the community, but in the school community as well. And so what is causing this? A lack of cultural responsiveness amongst our school staff, a hesitation perhaps to use mediation when fights break out, a one-size-fits-all discipline policy that can affect students' academic careers, not just their academic careers, but their lives, as we've seen through research with the school-to-prison pipeline. So amidst these disparities, though, many divisions, like Vickie Shoap's division in Fairfax County schools, are using restorative justice to resolve discipline disparities. I've personally seen examples of restorative justice where I began teaching in public schools in Oakland, California, and as well as on Oahu at the Native Hawaiian Charter School where I taught. You know, in indigenous communities, we don't have the same kind of strict punitive systems that we do in many of our school systems, in many of our public school systems. I remember growing up in Hawaii, one thing that we did when there was some sort of infraction or problem that you had against the community, we would go through a process called ho'oponopono, which means to bring things to righteousness again, where people would sit and talk about what happened and mediate through it. And so I've seen how restorative justice shows value for the culture of the person who has done something to hurt the community, how it can affect the future success of the student, and most importantly, how it can embed the student into the school community and give them ownership of their decision-making processes. So we're honored today to have two panelists who will help us consider what research and practice tells us about using restorative justice in our schools. We'll welcome up first Dr. Anne Gregory, who's returning home where she was once an assistant professor at the University of Virginia. She is currently an associate professor in the Department of Applied Psychology in Rutgers University. Her research has focused on the discipline disparities that African American students face in increased rates of school suspension and expulsion. She recently examined how restorative approaches to discipline have the potential to transform school climates. And the title of her talk today is Engaging Students in Problem Solving, a Civil Rights Remedy for Racial Disparities in Discipline. Dr. Gregory.
Good morning. How's this mic? Is this okay? Okay. I'm going to stay a little bit, it feels very strong, so I'm going to stay about right here. Okay. So today I'm going to actually start with some of the disturbing statistics we often see placed up on slides related to discipline gaps. And then I'm going to move into more of a positive youth development framework for us to think about restorative practices. You'll notice the question mark at the end of my title, because I want us to think critically about how restorative practices may or may not have the potential to reduce disparities. So I think that critical thinking about the theory underlying the program, how it's implemented, is really crucial for us as we move forward and we don't kind of grab onto the next shiny object. Okay, so let me get going here. So clearly there's an urgency to this issue, and finally, I've been very relieved to see so much national press around this issue. We see here, these are trends in secondary school suspension rates over time. There's been a slight uptick for Latino students over time, and that's crucial for us to keep an eye out on. What I've really focused in my own work, and there was a lot of discussion about this yesterday as well, is the tremendous racial discipline gap for African American students in particular. And we see here a 12% increase over time since the 1970s. So again, we can kind of get distant and cold from these statistics, but these are so many lives that are affected. The stress in the school, the stress from the parents' perspectives, the stress from the students. When there's a lot of conflict and exclusion from school, there's a whole cascade of events that occurs. And now I've noticed over the years, as I've presented in many districts and conferences, people really don't want to sit with the issue of race when we think about racial discipline gap. You know, there's this kind of implicit in the room, well, it's really about achievement gaps, it's about special ed disproportionality, it's about the pernicious correlations between poverty and race in many communities in our country. But in fact, I can confidently tell you that we've shown over and over again that achievement lags, poverty gaps, and education and special ed referrals and placements do not explain away racial disparities. Sure, they're contributors, and this is a complex issue reflecting so many different historical, socio-historical processes of economic and racial segregation. But I can confidently say that we need to sit with the issue around race when it comes to thinking about racial disparities. I'm going to give you a little more data on that before going into restorative practices. So this is a report. If anyone's interested in this, I strongly urge you to check out this report if you haven't already. This came out and really changed, I think really helped put this on the national map. And why it did, this report, was that they followed Texas middle school students over time. And for those of you who are interested in statistics, they accounted for 83 different risk factors because they had these giant statewide sample, including student special ed status, indicators of low achievement, and economic disadvantage. And what they showed, among many, many findings, was that compared to otherwise identical white and Latino students, African American students had a 31% higher likelihood of a school discretionary discipline action. Okay, so this has been replicated in many different studies to show that even when you account for the similar reasons for referrals for students, similar achievement levels, similar socioeconomic backgrounds, African American students are systematically treated more harshly. So this is, again, something that we really need to sit with in schools. But also, we don't want to kind of be too reductionistic about this issue. There's many other groups to be concerned about. The gender disparities in discipline start in pre-K. So what's going on for young boys in our school system? We also know for African American females, finally, there's increasing notice about how they're policed in school. And we see more and more city reports, for instance, coming out related to the very high rates of suspension of Black females. Latino students, now it depends on what region you're talking about in the U.S. In some regions, they're very much overrepresented in discipline data. In others, they're underrepresented compared to their enrollment. And others, they're comparably. So it's a more complex story when it comes to Latino students. So we need to dig into this and look at generational status and other language status, et cetera, and understand the complexities there. And increasingly, there's more and more attention on LGBT youth and gender nonconforming youth. And I cite here a national study, and hard to come by, showing that LGBT girls actually have higher rates of expulsion. So again, when we think about what people have termed intersectionality, we should look closely at LGBT youth of color and gender nonconforming youth of color to think carefully about what's happening and how schools may be policing difference. So a little bit more about the urgency. Again, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here when there's concerns about the overuse of suspension, but I just feel obligated as a researcher just to present some national data. So in my perspective, the snowball can start rolling down that hill and gaining momentum very early. So for students, I see kind of this small paper cuts of negative interaction with staff that can really accumulate, lowering something so important, which is the idea of being bonded to school. So if we think about suspended kids then running out into their homes, maybe watching video games or playing video games or hanging out with other peers who are truant, this is obviously of concern. And then, of course, we have to think complexly about what is the experience of being told you can't be in school. Could students internalize the self-fulfilling prophecy? I had one student say to me in an interview, you know, my teachers, they expect me to act the fool, so I'm going to act the fool. You know, and he just put it right out there, like, I see what they want from me, and I can do that really well. And then you lay over into this self-fulfilling prophecy issues of race and racial achievement gaps and discipline gaps. And could it be that people create along racial lines different senses of belonging? Who is school for? Who is school not for? So some national data here. We see here that this is a national data where they followed teens over time into their 20s. And we can see, looking across the blue bars, that 50 to 60% of non-disciplined youth go on for some college coursework. On the contrary, only 20 or so percent of students with 10 or more days of suspensions go on for later coursework. So this is correlational work, and there's many variables here to consider, but I think it's important to look at these patterns. Now, a more rigorous study accounted for risk factors leading to dropout, and they found that with every additional suspension, each suspension further decreased a student's odds of graduating high school by 20%. So what I take from this is that being suspended in and of itself produces risk, can propel a student down that negative trajectory. So it's almost like a school policy and a school act in and of itself can be pushing a student further. So it's not just, if we think about the behavior that could be leading to the dropout, but the actual school policies and practices. So I think everybody in the room has heard these terms by now, school to prison pipeline, the idea that there's a pipeline of students being sent into the discipline system, which then further increases the probability of interaction with the court system. And in fact, that study I mentioned in Texas did show that, again, using rigorous statistical analyses, a student who'd been disciplined more than 11 times faced a 1 in 5 chance of juvenile justice contact. Now, this is not limited to Texas. This is, again, the national data that I presented earlier. And what you'll see here is that 38% of frequently suspended African American males experience confinement in an adult or juvenile correctional facility compared to less than 10% of their non-suspended peers. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears in the last half of my talk. Where does this leave us? It pushes us to consider how schools can go from what we call deporting and disciplining to educating and resolving. And I'm really interested in that last phrase, educating and resolving. How can we flip the script on how behavior is handled in school so we can work on resolution and learning and kind of a healing process, while at the same time taking into account or implementing accountability, holding folks accountable for their behavior. So I worked with a whole bunch of folks for many years. We pulled together what we call an intervention brief. How can schools eradicate racial discipline gaps? And you can find it at that link below. And we came up with a framework. The idea is that schools need to work in complex ways to address these complex issues around prevention and intervention. And I think restorative practices falls very nicely into prevention and intervention principles. from a positive youth development framework. So I'm going to give you the quick overview of RJ and RP. So how many people in the room have heard of, let's start with, have heard of restorative practices and restorative justice? Okay, so how many people in the room do work directly or trainings or implementation of restorative practices? Okay, thank you. Gives me a sense of where folks are at. So those of you who are doing the work, I'm hoping you can join in your experience during the Q&A. So the 4 or 5 of you who raised your hands can talk to us about your experience and struggles and challenges and fabulous wins implementing it in your schools. But just briefly, and Vickie's going to tell us more about what's going on in Fairfax, but restorative approaches kind of, again, flip the script around discipline. There's a real process of let's roll up our sleeve, let's learn through the process of conflict in our community, let's repair the harm. A couple of things about terms. Now, I don't tend to get too caught up in these two different terms, so for me, we can use them interchangeably, but generally, people think of restorative justice as a theory of justice repairing harm, whereas restorative practices tends to be oriented towards a broader range of practices that include building community, setting the stage so that when there is conflict, everyone is better equipped to handle how to repair that. So for instance, here's a school district, San Francisco Unified. Now we see these kind of tiered systems of supports all over the place. For many of you may know, it's often seen related to what's called positive behavioral intervention supports, or PBIS, but now a lot of folks are taking the restorative practices and laying it into this triangle. So I'm sorry if the font's small in the back. The tier 1 interventions, you'll see community building circles. Teachers are sitting in a circle, passing what they call a talking piece around in a circle. Kids have an opportunity to each share and have their voice heard about a relevant topic in their lives. There's an emphasis on affective language. How has conflict impacted you and the other person emotionally, or how do relationships, an emphasis on really learning how to express and having kind of greater emotional literacy. Tier 2 is when, at least in San Francisco Unified, they do some problem-solving circles and repairing harm, and then conferencing is a more formal process. I think Vickie will go into. This is the International Institute of Restorative Practices. This is their continuum of practices. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into each of them, but I can break it down for folks who are interested later. What I do want to emphasize, though, fundamental to most of these practices are these types of questions. This idea of pushing students to reflect upon conflict. What things need to happen to make things right. Now here, what I want to point out is the person who has been harmed is systematically integrated into this process. So it's not just the person with the misconduct who's kind of extracted from the situation. The idea here is with the proper scaffolding, the person who's been harmed has voice to talk about how they've been affected. I think this was really what distinguishes it from a lot of other discipline programs. So in one of my studies, I got very curious, what does a restorative classroom look like? What does a restorative school look like? These are the types of questions we asked in one particular study. We asked students to answer. And we went on and asked them some more questions about, how many responsive circles or proactive circles, FAIR process was used. So this is very preliminary, very small scale study. But what I did find is that teachers who were perceived by their students as implementing RP more often tended to issue fewer disruption and defiance referrals to African American and Latino students. And so infrequent RP implementers, on the other hand, had larger racial discipline gaps. This is not a randomized controlled trial. This is correlational, so there's lots to think about here. But I think it does hint at something going on with those high RP implementers. There's something relational where they could be preventing, diffusing, building trust with their students, keeping them in the classroom. So in Oakland, they came out recently with an evaluation report that I think also showed some promise for reducing racial disparities. They showed that for African American students in the district, the suspension rates were declining at significantly greater rates compared to other groups. They also showed that attendance was going up, that some reading proficiency was going up in RJ schools. So I think, again, there was a lot of hints here that there could be something going on in these processes to narrow racial disparities. But we also need to keep our eye out on some randomized controlled trials and the results that will come out so we can make some more causal attributions. So in the last minutes of my talk, I have to talk about implementation. So what I'm seeing a lot is there's this kind of, as I mentioned, the shiny object. RP is, there's a little bit of a wildfire going on. People are trying to sort out, let's get some trainers in, let's bring them in. We're really excited about this. There's always resistance. So they pull together the funds for a 3 to 5 day initial workshop. And there's a lot of excitement and a lot of new knowledge. Then you hear things like this if you follow these teachers later. So many initiatives came our way, kind of was lost, a lot of its impact. The circles get lost. And so I actually tracked this teacher over time and a cohort of them, and they had incredible enthusiasm at the end when I gave them surveys at the end of a workshop on circles. A year later, about close to 60 to 70% had run 0 or 1 circle in their classroom. So they had spent 3 to 5 days in a circle training, and then 0 or 1 had actually run circles, community building circles. So I don't think this is anything unusual to training, but we know that homeostasis really wins the day. It's something as big as changing how you approach building community and resolving conflict in your classroom. It's very hard to do. So enthusiasm can fizzle. And I really think it's incumbent upon us to think very critically and carefully. If school districts are going to invest in money, where's the implementation support? So are there coaching programs in place? So are there peer learning opportunities? Are there opportunities to celebrate success and how it's being implemented? And then in terms of thinking through fidelity of implementation, here's just a model that I've kind of latched onto and really like these days, to really think carefully, how well was the program delivered? How well was it received? And to what extent did participants enact what was learned? So every step of the way, we can think where the program implementation can falter. And if it's going well in some sections of the school, where can we shine a light on those sections? But I also think we have to think carefully about what is high quality restorative practice. So what are the characteristics of conferences or circles, and this is something I'm doing a lot of work on right now, that increase sense of trust, belonging, and decrease suspicion, implicit bias, or alienation? Ultimately, from a PYD perspective, we want students to have voice. We want them to demonstrate perspective taking, empathy. We want them to learn through a process of problem solving. So in this way, we want them to take away some positive social and emotional learning skills. But let me stop for a minute. Sometimes we think about mediation, we think student-student, right? But so much discipline relates to struggles between adults and students. So we need adults to participate in this process and learn social and emotional cultural competency skills through the process also. So imagine students, teachers, adults in the room, adults in the building, who can really gain new perspectives about the complexity of their students' lives. This is where I see the promise, the kernels of promise for reducing racial disparities. It's something about really seeing those students differently and their everyday struggles that I think could undo some of the pernicious processes that are fueling the racial discipline gap. So I wanted to end, since I have about 30 seconds left, with a few upbeat words from students themselves. These are students who take away something from the conference. This one Latino male said, "Even outside of here, you have it in your head. I've done this like 5 times. I got into trouble. I did the questions right there in my head, the restorative questions. They looked at me like, what? But I'm like, oh, nothing. I'm just doing the restorative questions." So there's a student who kind of really took it in and went through his life with this. Here's another student. This white male high school student explained, "I learned how to handle a situation if it comes up, like taking action steps on how to fix a problem, like cause and effect. Now I generally handle them in a more respectful way, just talking to the person." And then an African-American female high school student said, "I actually learned how to listen. I learned how to express myself and tell how I really feel before I get mad." So these 3 young people, I think, are pointing to some learning gains that can arise through these processes. They report managing their emotions differently and conflict differently. So back up for a second, and let's think about a whole hog shift, a restorative mindset in schools, where educators are also learning these emotion regulation skills, who are increasing their perspective taking on the students' lives, where there's an active change and thoughtfulness about how to build community and relationships, even through conflict. So educators and students would slow down, which is hard to ask in these days, to even slow down at all, with all the demands, manage conflict differently in parent-teacher meetings, in cafeterias, in staff meetings, in faculty meetings. So I think a really good restorative community are using these processes among the staff themselves. So this is something for us to think about in terms of the promise for possible civil rights remedy, but I think we need to keep pushing on this issue and see where this program can take us. Thank you.